As part of President Trump's purge of top military leaders Friday night, he also moved to replace Judge Advocates General, or JAGs, at the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. JAGs are the military's top lawyers. They administer the military code of justice, and perhaps most relevantly, as Biden's former Secretary of the Air Force, Fred Kendall, noted, quote, "These are the generals who have the independent legal authority to tell any military commander that an order from the president or the Secretary of Defense is unlawful and cannot be obeyed," unquote. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refers to JAGs in his book as jagoffs, saying that JAGs put their own priorities, quote, "in front of having the backs of those who are making the tough calls on the front line," unquote. During his first term in 2019, President Trump, at the urging of Hegseth from his perch at Fox and others, Trump pardoned several service members facing high-profile war crimes allegations against the advice of the top leaders of the Pentagon. But it does not seem enough for President Trump and his team to be able to overrule those in his administration who might enforce guardrails or provide oversight. They don't even seem to want them there to begin with, because Trump's push to squash oversight did not begin with the firing of the JAGs. Among his very first acts as president was to fire 18 inspectors general. These are the independent government watchdogs who provide oversight of cabinet agencies. Why would Trump want to get rid of all of them? 18. He hasn't explained, as he's legally required to do. What would those inspectors general have to say about the ethics and the legality of the mass firings going on? We don't know. They were fired first, including those, according to a New York Times analysis, at 11 federal agencies with more than 32 continuing investigations, pending complaints, or enforcement actions into companies owned by Elon Musk. So what is the response to that from the head of the Office on Governmental Ethics, which monitors financial conflicts of interest across the government? Well, we don't know, because Trump fired him earlier this month. You're starting to sense a theme here. Independence in the Trump administration does not seem to be valued. In fact, it seems to be denigrated. On Tuesday, Trump signed a far-reaching executive order expanding the White House powers over supposedly independent agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Election Commission. These are areas that Congress intended to not be under direct presidential control. Given the compliant nature of the legislative branch, and thus the so-called oversight committees, and yes, Senator Grassley, I remember when you cared about inspectors general, one has to ask, what is the end game here when it comes to this Trump effort to remove watchdogs, to prevent them from doing their jobs? What does he not want you, the American people, what does he want you to not know about what's going on in your government?
The clock is ticking for tens of thousands of federal workers to respond to a new ultimatum from Elon Musk. Reply to an email or lose your job. Over the weekend, the world's richest man firing off a post saying all federal employees must respond to an email detailing what they got done last week. Failing to respond by midnight tonight will be taken as a resignation. The deadline comes as 2,000 USAID workers were laid off Sunday night, and the vast majority of remaining full-time staffers at the agency were told they're now being placed on administrative leave. The move's getting the full support of President Trump, who hailed the actions against USAID at a gathering of his supporters over the weekend.
We've also effectively ended the left-wing scam known as USAID, the agency's name.
The president also seemingly mocking federal workers being threatened with a deadline by Elon Musk. President Trump sent out this meme starring SpongeBob SquarePants, implying the responses from workers justifying their jobs might include things like crying about Trump or reading some emails. But now some senators in his own party seem to be pushing back against the moves from Musk. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski calling out Musk on social media, saying he should learn about the jobs he's trying to cut, adding, quote, "Our public workforce deserves to be treated with dignity and respect for the jobs they perform. The absurd weekend email to justify their existence wasn't it." Republican Senator John Curtis of Utah echoed those thoughts.
If I could say one thing to Elon Musk, it's like, please put a dose of compassion in this. These are real people. These are real lives. These are mortgages. It's a false narrative to say we have to cut and you have to be cruel to do it as well. We can do both.
Joining me now to talk about all of this, Alex Thompson, CNN political analyst and national political reporter for Axios, Megan Hayes, former Biden White House director of message planning, and Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and former senior advisor to Tim Scott's presidential campaign. Matt, I'll start with you because we were just talking about some of the Republican pushback here. It's bubbling up. It's starting to grow. But do you think it's reached a fever pitch where some of this advice would actually flow through to the way that DOJ is approaching its work?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think Murkowski and Curtis are indicative kind of where the median of the party is at. But look, I think in principle, it's pretty common sense. Should be accountable for what you do and ready to talk about it. I think where it gets headlong into specifically some of these with the cabinet secretaries and agencies is that it's going through OPM, right, which is essentially the HR of the federal government and not through the respective agencies. And that's where I think you saw specifically military intel, whether it's DOD, DNI with Tulsi Gabbard, people who, again, not necessarily squishies by any stretch of the imagination in the Trump administration, Kash Patel at the FBI, saying, hey, hold off on responding for a little bit, or maybe we will handle that in-house. Because otherwise, if you put the wrong thing in the email, it might be just a little light reading for the Chinese government. So I think that is kind of where you're seeing some of this kind of run a little bit. I think if you were to ask a lot of these cabinet secretaries, they'd rather be the ones handling this review or this justification rather than OPM as a whole.
And Megan, that's why we've seen such a disparity in the way that some of these agencies have responded already. The Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, FBI, NIH, NTSB, the list goes on of some of these agencies who are actually saying, wait, hold off. We're trying to figure out, A, whether you should respond to this, and B, what you actually can put in this email. So what does that tell you about, if you're a federal worker, are you just paralyzed by what's going on?
I think there's a lot of chaos. I think a lot of people are feeling very chaotic. 95% of the federal government doesn't work in the DMV, so they are not living this every day and the feelings here and inside the bubble. So they are getting their news from their local news and other sources, and they're not entrenched in it every day. But I will say I've worked at two Fortune 100 companies and been part of restructuring where we did mass layoffs. It took months to plan. There was a lot of planning that went into it. There was a lot of thought that went into how this was going to be done and the programs that were going to be cut and the offices that we were going to move into different places in the company. There is none of that being done here. So I think that what these agency heads are starting to realize, they don't know what they're actually cutting. They are just got confirmed within the past couple of weeks. They don't know what they're actually cutting. They have no idea what they need and don't need. And to have Elon Musk out there just like slashing things is really irresponsible for how our government works.
There's also an element of trolling here, Alex, because Elon Musk posted on social media after some of the blowback to this email saying, hey, I was just thinking that maybe some of these employees weren't actually checking their email on a weekend to boot. And I have the post up here right now. The reason this matters is that a significant number of people who are supposed to be working are doing so little work, they're not checking their email at all. But certainly there's been a heavy dose of trolling on the other side, too, now that this email address was made public, with people generally who don't even work for the federal government giving Elon Musk a piece of their mind.
Sure. I mean, if there was any doubt about the trolling, I think the chainsaw for the bureaucracy on Saturday night was indicative of it. But I can tell you the Trump team, completely unapologetic about any of this backlash. They do not care. In fact, they think they see the backlash as sort of evidence that they're doing the right thing. Now, the question is, does that eventually, because I think Democrats are counting that, voters want to cut government, but they don't like chaos. That's what Democrats are sort of betting on, that eventually, if you are going to take a chainsaw versus a scalpel, will that eventually create a political backlash that will end up hurting congressional Republicans?
Well, and Senator Curtis alluded to this a little bit, Matt, but then there's also the financial element of this. These are real people. These are real mortgages. These are livelihoods. At what point do you think that cutting hundreds of thousands of workers has an impact on the economy? And does that resonate with President Trump?
It may, but I think, again, the way you have to talk about this if you're Republicans is that the government is not immune to the same factors that the private sector feels, as Megan talked about in her answer, right? These government jobs are not lifetime contracts. People understand layoffs. They understand buyouts. And I take your point a little bit on kind of the planning that's needed to happen. I think it's where you get Elon is the good and the bad, right? Someone who's bold enough to go deep as it needs to, but then you also get, as even Jim Jordan kind of admitted, there were some mistakes made. And I think that's how you correct them. But again, the fact that Amazon, Google, Stripe, Microsoft, just in the last 60 days have laid off people, and people understand that in the private sector.
But
They do.
They gave a lot of notice before their layoffs, and they were planned. I mean, when Meta laid off people last year, they announced layoffs months beforehand, and it was a planned
Well, they announced that
thing.
they're having them, not that they actually.
Right, but I'm saying people could plan, their departments could plan. People understood that they might be on the chopping block to get laid off. They understood what their severance was. They understood they weren't having to send emails about justifying their jobs. And I understand that these are not lifetime contracts. No one is saying that. I just think Donald Trump doesn't care because he won't have to pay the repercussions. These congressional members are going to have to pay the repercussions, as you're seeing in some of these town halls.
I think that would be very different, though, because, again, I went through this in 2018. I know we might talk about this later.
And we'll have this be the last word here.
Yeah, well, I think what you're seeing in 2016, there was a reawakening. People were kind of asleep with the 2016 election. They came back and acted through the resistance movement and those town halls specifically related to healthcare. This is a little different. When you see signs about fascism, that's not the median voter.